The topic is newer terminologies on OCT. No more, see more. We have Dr. Neha Goel with us. May I request Dr. Neha Goel to please chair the next session and please do the honors to inviting our next speaker. I guess Dr. Neha Goel itself is going to present her first slide. So over to you, Dr. Neha.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prasad. And I thank AIOS, the entire scientific committee, the organizing committee, for allowing me to conduct this instruction course. And also congratulations on the first virtual conference. So the name of this IC is Newer Terminologies on OCT, Know More and See More. So why did I think of this IC? A simple reason: the eyes don't see what the mind doesn't know. And continuous medical education is not just important, it's essential, because you only treat what you see, you only see what you look for, and you only look for what you know. So this IC is an attempt to update ourselves on the newer terminologies on OCT so that we can look for these things and we can understand these better for better care of our patients. There are four talks and four speakers in this IC, and it's my pleasure to introduce my co-instructors. Vitreoretinal interface abnormalities will be talked upon by Dr. Dipinder V. Singh. Intraretinal abnormalities pertaining to OCT biomarkers in diabetic retinopathy will be discussed by Dr. Gopal S. Pillai. Newer terms in AMD will be discussed by Dr. Vinod Kumar Agarwal. And the choroid will be explored by myself, Dr. Neha Goel. So let's start with a knowledge of the current nomenclature and some landmarks on OCT which have reached consensus. Now, we know that OCT is based on the principle of Michelson interferometry. It's a non-invasive, non-contact imaging modality, which gives us almost micron resolution cross-sectional representation of the retinal layers. Not just for retinologists, but even for ophthalmologists, I would say it is one of the most commonly performed ocular investigations. Now, we've literally seen all these generations of OCT, which started with time domain OCT in the early 2000s, followed by spectral or Fourier domain OCT, ultra high resolution, and now the swept source OCT. So basically what we are looking at is increasing resolution from the tune of 10 to 15 microns to up to even 1 micron now. Here's an image, which shows you just exactly what the difference is, what we are talking about.
And Dr. Neha, I can't see your PowerPoint yet. Really, you have to share it. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Is it visible now?
Yes, Dr. Neha, it's visible.
So as I was saying, this I've already covered, and these are our speakers who will be covering these topics. So yes, so the generations on OCT, the time domain, spectral domain, ultra high resolution, and then the swept source OCT. And here are the images which will tell you exactly what a difference in resolution translates to when we look at the image of the OCT. And here I'd like to point out that earlier, while we were used to very colorful images, it's now preferable to see the black and white images for better appreciation of details and not to miss features or structures that may be masked by these pseudo colors. So again, just revising, the wavelength is the same in time and spectral domain, whereas in swept source, we have a longer wavelength. There was a single detector in time domain replaced by a spectrometer in spectral domain, and now a photodiode detector in swept source OCT. Of course, the number of A scans per second is almost more than 10 times over these, and the scan length has also increased, allowing for a wider area to be visible in a single scan. And as I said, the resolution has been decreasing. So the interpretation of an OCT image depends on the optical properties of the tissue, namely absorption, transmission, and the scattering. So the backscatter or the reflected is one which is responsible for the OCT signal. So we have structures which are hyperreflective, such as inflammation, hard exudates, blood, and scars. And then we have structures which are hyporeflective, such as edema, serous fluid, and sometimes shadowing from hyperreflective structures. So when we clinically interpret an OCT, these are the layers that we look at: the vitreoretinal interface and the foveal contour, the retinal architecture, and the RP choriocapillaris complex. And now with EDI and swept source, two more important structures have been added, namely the vitreous and the choroid and the choroidoscleral junction. So let's first understand what normal looks like. This is a normal scan, a swept source OCT scan, which we are familiar with: the foveal contour, the layers, and the choroid. So be wary of this bulge that you see under the fovea. This is normal. And these structures are actually blood vessels which cause underlying shadowing. They should not be misinterpreted as abnormal structures. Whenever you look at a scan, be sure to corroborate with the fundus image and be sure to note the direction of the scan which has been taken. Now, starting with the vitreous, the enhanced vitreous mode allows us to see these structures which were earlier not possible. And here we see what is known as the precortical vitreous pocket. So this is connected to the Clockwitz canal by a valve, which has been shown histopathologically and is now visible on swept source OCT as well. And many of us would have encountered this when we, stain the vitreous, especially in cases of macular hole, etc. Intraoperatively, we exactly get this kind of structural feel there as well. Now, in this landmark paper by the International Consensus Panel on OCT, published in Ophthalmology in 2014, these are the terminologies which have been introduced, which we currently use. Now, the authors noted slight differences in the Heidelberg spectralis and the Zeiss OCT, and hence these two different images. So starting from the anteriormost layer, which is the posterior cortical vitreous, next we go to this pre-retinal space, followed by the nerve fiber layer, which is hyperreflective, the ganglion cell layer, which is moderately hyperreflective, the inner plexiform, and then the inner nuclear layer, which is hyporeflective, and then again the outer plexiform, which is hyperreflective. Now, this is followed by the outer nuclear layer, which is a hyporeflective band. And following this, we get our first line, which is the external limiting membrane, or the ELM. This is followed by two zones, the myoid and the ellipsoid zone. The ellipsoid zone is hyperreflective because it is said to contain more of the mitochondria. And then after this, we have another zone, which is the outer segment of the photoreceptors. This is followed by the IZ, or the interdigitation zone. And then finally, we have the RPE Brooks complex. So this small space is tightly packed by these zones and membranes, which are said to contain various parts of the photoreceptor. Now, after this, coming on to the choroid, the anteriormost are the choriocapillaries. This is followed by the Sattler's layer, which are the medium-sized choroidal vessels, and then the Haller's layer, which is the large-sized choroidal vessels, and then the choroid-scleral junction. So here you see these same structures on the serous OCT. Now, next, coming to the visualization of the choroid. So there are two current methods by which we can do this. First is the EDI, or the enhanced depth imaging OCT. Now, this moves the imaging focal point of the spectral domain OCT, that is the zero delay line, more posteriorly, allowing for a stronger returning reflection from the choroid, resulting in better definition of details. This is what we have on our Heidelberg spectralis. The other way to image the choroid is through swept source OCT. Now here, as we know, the wavelength is longer, the number of A scans per second is more. So this allows for increased tissue penetration, almost double of spectral domain. Hence, even in very thickened choroids, you can see the choroidoscleral junction on swept source OCT. Now, the choroidal thickness should be interpreted with caution. It is highly dependent on age. As we see, with age, this thickness should decrease. But in the pachychoroid spectrum disorders, we see an increase in the thickness, which would not corroborate with the age. Similarly, RAP and subretinal drusenoid deposits, these are disorders where you would see more choroidal thinning as opposed to the pachychoroid disorders. Now, so to conclude, there have been unprecedented advances in the imaging of the retina and the choroid. Recognition of newly described terminologies has clinical implications and may provide insights into histopathology. and pathophysiology. We need to keep abreast of this proliferation of literature and apply it in day-to-day practice. Getting a better grip of these newer concepts and imbibing them will eventually improve outcomes for our patients. Newer concepts also lead to more questions, which when formalized can convert into research ideas, and such projects can add meaningful contributions to global scientific literature. So thank you for this introduction. And now we'll, any comments from the speakers, from the remaining speakers?
Sorry to interrupt in between, Dr. Neha, but we'll have a panel discussion at the end. If the time permits, we'll go with the speakers first.
Yeah, so we already have around 4 minutes remaining.
Yes, no
Welcome,
problem.
Dr. Gopal.
Yeah.
Hi.
Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you.
Thank you. So any comments from the speakers? Otherwise, we'll go to the next talk.
Go to the next talk. This was just a sweet introduction.
Okay. So next, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Dipinder Singh to give his talk on vitreoretinal interface abnormalities. Dr. Dipinder is an alumni of the illustrious All India Institute of Medical Sciences at New Delhi. He is currently a director and head of vitreoretinal services at the IQ Group of Eye Hospitals and practices in Gurgaon. Thank you, Dr. Dipinder. Please start.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Neha, and excellent presentation, I must say. And I think that landmark article in 2014 did a lot of good to people who are involved in retinal imaging. I think a standardization in terminology was the need of our, because there were so many publications coming out and people had no idea that how to build a consensus. Because unlike radiology, our imaging has still not a very robust committee for, accepting these terminologies. But I think it's an excellent idea to discuss it in this instruction course. And I thank Scientific Committee, AIUS, and especially you for actually I think you envisaged it long back, 2-3 years back, that we should do a proper conference on this, a meeting. And so once again, that's a very good idea. So I got this opportunity to learn and read more about lamellar hole associated epiretinal proliferation. And this is a very important OCT finding for everybody who is involved in medical as well as surgical retina, and described for first time in 2014 by Spade and Bang. It was initially described like was in cases with lamellar macular hole, and the features which they described was that you will find an irregular foveal contour. There will be an inner retinal defect. There also would be a dehiscence of inner retina. Just give me a second. Yeah, from outer retina, and there will be an absence of full thickness defect like you see in full thickness macular hole. So that means your photoreceptor layers would be intact. Before we move on to in further details, meanwhile, we also were seeing a lot of lamellar macular hole cases, and this is one such case where we were following this lady, and she was maintaining 6/9 vision till October 2016, when she had a drop in this vision in the left eye, and we operated with a fovea sparing, ILM peel, and you can see the ILM flap, and luckily we didn't land up into a full thickness macular hole, and you can see foveal contour nicely restored after the surgery. On the other hand, very recently, in 2019, again we got this case with lamellar macular hole, and he was posted for surgery, and he had a different looking epiretinal membrane, and we operated and we landed up into a full thickness macular hole. So I'll talk about this case later, but I think going back to our history of analyzing OCTs of epiretinal membranes in much more detail. So it was way back in 2006 when Witkin et al. have noticed that there are some ERMs which are different on high resolution OCT. And then in 2011, I think Barbara did a great job when she actually differentiated these two different membranes on OCT, and she said there is one group which has dense membranes and the another group which has normal membranes, tractional membranes. But it was again in 2014, Pang and Spade. I'll talk about this article in more detail. And then I think this group, Govito, along with David Saraf, they did a wonderful job in not only describing it further as degenerative and tractional lamellar macular holes, they've also given a very nice classification of ERMs based on how much invasion of fovea occurs by surrounding inner retinal layers. So I'll talk about it later. So this was the landmark Barbara's article, and where she actually not only peeled these membranes, analyzed their OCT, she also analyzed these membranes histopathologically. And what was reported was that there are two different membranes on your left side. That is, the A photograph shows the tractional membrane, which is highly reflective. And on the right side, there is a dense membrane, which was visible as a yellow tissue on intraoperatively, and it was more smooth looking membrane with medium reflectivity. And she also reported that folding and wrinkles is very less with these dense membranes. But then I think Pang and Spade explored this thing further, and they reported that calling them thick or dense membrane is not good enough. We need to give them a different name. And that's how they described this lamellar hole associated epiretinal proliferation. So they said that it's a variety of epiretinal membrane, but here what you see is a homogeneous collection of medium reflectivity. Now, as Dr. Neha was nicely telling us about that, when we are reading OCT scans, we are describing things, as they reflect the laser light. And reference for this reflectivity is within the scan itself. So vitreous has the lowest reflectivity and RPE has the highest reflectivity. So if you see LHEP, which will be seen on retinal surface, has medium reflectivity, which will match the reflectivity of middle retinal layers. So inner plexiform and inner nuclear layers. So it will resemble something in between that. Another feature what they described was that it will have a variable thickness. At some portions it will be thick and other portions it will be thinner. And you will see it across all the layers. It will be spanning the base of the hole also. So, and all wherever it's going, you will see the same medium reflectivity. So that is a very characteristic feature of LHEP. And initially they described it with lamellar macular holes only, but there were then more groups who have seen that this can be seen with full thickness macular holes also. But they also highlighted that why this is a distinct entity. The one interesting observation they made was that it will always be seen whenever there are inner retinal defects and there is dehiscence of inner retina from outer retina. So this was a very striking thing they noted, and they also found that it's very difficult to see it clinically on fundus picture or on your 90D examination. And the foldings and wrinkles associated with classical epiretinal membrane are very less commonly seen with LHEP. And on this analysis of the collagen, after removing these membranes, have also shown different components. I'll not go into the molecular details, but histopathologically and imaging wise, they could see that this membrane is different from our regular membrane. Of course, on NFAS also, you can see the difference. LHEP doesn't have that wrinkles and folds. It's more of a smooth kind of a membrane, unlike your regular ERM. And of course, I think most of the things when we try to find the origin end up at Muller cells. So current understanding is that Muller cells and the other glial cells contribute to this LHEP. Now, coming back to our own case, when I went back and analyzed the whole thing in retrospective, I saw that this was LHEP was of variable thickness, and it was spanning the base of the lamellar macular hole. You can see the two important characteristics nicely visible in this case. I'll talk about it, what went wrong in our case, but another group who accepted this classification and this terminology LHEP, they operated 43 eyes with lamellar macular hole, out of which 19 eyes had LHEP. but they modified their surgical technique. They did a foveal sparing ILM peeling for them and did not avulse this membrane from the base. And interestingly, their rate of macular hole, post-surgery macular hole formation was remarkably low. And they also added more to the information added by Spade et al. So one thing they noted was that if you look carefully, then you can actually see the yellow material corresponding with LHEP on your color photograph also. So exactly what Dr. Neha was highlighting, that eyes will see only when brain knows what to see. Second, this modified peeling technique may be a good idea if you plan to operate a patient with LHEP. And in their series, chances of restoring photoreceptor lines were after surgery was much higher in eyes with LHEP. So this was again an interesting observation. And they also found that folds in retina can be seen in eyes with LHEP also. So it's not an exclusive thing for other variety of ERM. You can have a mix and match. And they also found LHEP in full thickness macular hole. So according to them, implication of LHEP could be, one is that there can be a high incidence of post of full thickness macular hole formation. So modify your peeling approach. They even suggested that if it's a reparative process, and if you see a small full thickness hole with LHEP, you can actually observe it. It might facilitate spontaneous closure. So in our case, I think coming back, actually, because we knew that this patient had LHEP, our plan was to spare the fovea, and we were planning foveal sparing ERM and ILM peeling. Unfortunately, when we were, and you can see I was not avulsing this LHEP, but at the time when I was trying to aspirate the excess dye, I think I ended up sucking the flap, the ERM flap, and that probably led to avulsion. And even when I did a inverted flap for this case, as you have seen, we landed up into post of macular hole. Now another, I think there is a case report where again they have done same thing. They have actually not avulsed this LHEP, and they have just used it as a flap, and they had a very nice closure after surgery, no macular hole, and you see restoration of almost all the lines. So I think there is another group which has studied full thickness macular hole, and so they also found that these can be associated with lamellar hole associated proliferation. So coming to the next topic, the ectopic inner foveal layer. So that was all about LHEP, but this was again our own cases. When we go back and look, this was operated long back, and we could see even at 6-year follow-up, despite good visual recovery, there is no foveal pit. And all of us have seen these cases. When you operate, even when you remove ILM, this foveal pit doesn't come back. Another patient, same. So I'll quickly rush through the cases. But
Well,
this was a gentleman in the
you
group.
can take your time. We have a lot of excess time from my talk also. Please, you can take your time.
Fine, I think fine.
Yes, Dr. Dipendra, please take your time. We
Okay,
have access
thank
time.
you. So I think this was a group Govito. I think this is again a very landmark article, and I'm sure this must be cited again and again. We are seeing more and more reports citing it. And he actually analyzed these OCTs in further detail, and we all were seeing epiretinal membranes, and people were trying to find what can be the prognostic indicator for OCT based prognostic indicator for these ERMs. So I think he first and his group actually tried to classify these cases, and how he classified was that in stage 1, when you see a simple epiretinal membrane, but everything else is fine. So they categorize as stage 1, that where you can see a foveal pit and all the layers are at their place. There is no increase in thickness of retina. Outer nuclear layer is also same. Unlike this, in stage 2, they describe that you lose your foveal pit. So the pit is lost, and there is elongation of foveal cones. Outer nuclear layer gets elongated, but the other foveola is still devoid of any of the layers which are not there normally. And in stage 3, you have all what you have in stage 2. But apart from that, there is an invasion of inner nuclear and inner plexiform layers in the foveolar area. Now, this is again very important that before you label any epiretinal membrane as stage 3, you have to do 360-degree scans, and you make sure you are scanning the center of the macula. It's not an eccentric scan. This is what they also highlighted. But in stage 3, you can still make out all the layers. There is no disorganization. When there is disorganization and you lose the you can't identify these inner retinal layers, then you label it stage 4. So this, I think, classification was initially proposed, but I think now a lot of studies have found it very useful, and it's a very reproducible classification which they proposed. Not only this, out of lot of parameters, except for this, the integrity of photoreceptor lines, I think presence and thickness of ectopic inner foveal layer has a very important bearing on prognosis after surgery. I think all other OCT-based features have very little impact on visual recovery after ERM surgery. So again, EIFL is a very landmark finding in epiretinal membrane, and this is something which I was discussing, that before we diagnose or stage these membranes, I think we have to ensure that our findings are seen 360-degree in all the scans. And best way to look for EIFL is do a densely packed raster scan over the fovea, so that know what is happening at the center. And sometimes the conditions, congenital conditions like foveal plana and foveal hypoplasia, they can also mimic EIFL. So of course you will scan the fellow eye and see if most of these conditions, the congenital ones, are bilateral, and so you can rule out. Another important thing they highlighted is the progression is even more diagnostic, which is probably true for most OCT findings. That if you see them progressing, then it virtually rules out congenital anomaly. And even in their series, they have seen that these cases progress from stage 1 to stage 2. So this is again, I think, a very useful learning from their series, that this staging is not only a one-time analysis, it's actually a serial analysis, and the cases can progress from stage 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and same thing happens after surgery. You operate a stage 4 case, you can convert it into 3 or 2, and these patients get a visual benefit. So I think to conclude, I think I have already told this, that EIFL itself may not indicate poor prognosis, but it's a very landmark and important finding. And this classification is, I think, very useful, and we are getting a lot of reports which are highlighting using this classification. The another important findings, I think, which this group brought to our notice was tractional abnormalities that happen at foveola, and they have described 3 peculiar signs. One is cotton ball sign, where you get this hyper reflective ball-like appearance in these cases with VMT at the fovea, and then there can be a foveolar detachment, and sometimes a full-fledged vitelliform deposits can also occur. So these are all 3 very minor OCT findings at foveola, which again can help us. We are still not sure prognostic importance and relevance of these findings, but I'm sure they will be taken up by more classifying systems. So that's it. Thank you, and I think we'll take in questions at the end. So over to you, Dr. Neha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dipinder. That was an excellent presentation. And thank you for sharing your cases, even the one which did not do well. I mean, that is of paramount importance. And again, thank you for this brush up. I learned a lot, and we are going to discuss this at the end of the talks. So I also welcome Dr. Vinod, who is now present with us. And so the next talk is going to be by Dr. Gopal S. Pillai. And Dr. Gopal is again an alumnus of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. He's the head of ophthalmology at Amrita Institute of Medical Sciences in Kochi. He's also the secretary of the Cochin Ophthalmic Club, an avid academician and a very familiar face in AIOS. So welcome, Dr. Gopal, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Neha. I hope I am audible.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. What we are going to discuss today would be, one second. What we are going to discuss today would be OCT biomarkers in diabetic retinopathy. A biomarker is a naturally occurring molecule, gene, or characteristic which may be measurable and by which the pathology or disease process can be identified or prognosticated. And here today we are looking at imaging. First thing we will look at is quantitative information, right from retinal thickness and volume in many machines. It is repeatable, reproducible, and over different areas like ETDRS circles of 500 microns. There will be inner and outer rings, and it is always calculated by segmentation. This is a typical volumetric or quantitative measure, which this is out of a Cirrus machine, and this is a very important thing that it is useful in detecting subclinical macular edema for a close follow-up, invaluable in longitudinal follow-up of patients, and indicated in diabetic macular edema always. But we should know how much thickening is actually retinal thickening. So different machines have different thickening measures like Zeiss, Cirrus. For males and females, it is different as far as Heidelberg also. There's a little bit of increased thickness, which is read in Heidelberg. Now let us go into the qualitative information. So we all look at quantitative information before we treat any patient, but qualitative information gives us a lot of information regarding the prognosis of the patient, etc. These are the changes in morphology of the VR interface, the inner layers, the outer layers, and change in reflectivities. So before that, let us go into a OCT classification that is very widely accepted, like spongy, cystoid, SMD, vitreomacular traction, plaque, and mixed. So these are some examples of spongy edema where there is a spongy overall edematous thickening. And when you have limited to the cysts, maybe smaller cysts or larger cysts, we say it's a cystoid macular edema. Then we have sensory neural detachment or SMD. And then we have the vitreoretinal interface problems, which Dr. Dipender just dealt with. It can also occur in diabetics with taut hyaloid or vitreomacular adhesion or traction, which is more of a vertical component. So these are different things. So what qualitative changes are we actually looking for in these OCTs? One is thickening, obviously, and loss of the contour, and then hyporeflective spaces within the retina, which is the inner retina, the swollen Muller cells, etc. Then the hard exudates, the epiretinal membranes, the VMT, the cystoid spaces, the submacular detachment, the high reflective spots, ISOS junction is a very important thing in the outer retina, presence of drill in the inner retina, and a combination of all these factors. Usually when you look at an OCT, a combination of these factors may be looking at it. So let us go to them one by one. Cystoid spaces represent areas of necrosis of Muller cells and adjacent cells. They can be small, intermediate, or large. The larger the space, generally, it is more chronic. And it's black non-reflective spaces surrounded by medium or low reflective septate. So that's a small cystoid space, but you can see there's a large cystoid space which may tell us that this is a more chronic disease. What about a submacular detachment? It's a low reflective area under the neurosensory retina and over the RPE. It is well defined, and some people have talked about traction, some people have talked about duration, and about systemic factors like renal failure and high blood pressure. Now, this is a submacular detachment. And next thing that we will look at is ELM and the ISOS integrity, which are very thin layers just on top of the retinal pigment epithelium. So interface abnormalities are hyperreflective lines just above the inner retina, and there could be points of adhesion, multiple points of adhesion, and also retinal distortion. There could be a significant vertical component like that, or maybe a little bit of thing only. There could be questionable traction, etc. Now, disorganization of the inner layers means that the inner layers are completely disorganized. You can see that there is no structural integrity seen, which can also be there in multiple mixed patterns. Now, these are hyperreflective spots. At this point of time, I would like to make a small difference between hyperreflective spots, which are small dots in the inner retina, whereas hard exudates are more reddish and they are seen in the further inner retina. ISOS junction, ELM, I just told you, they are very important in looking at the prognosis. Now, newer classification systems based on OCT will take into account the thickening, the morphology of edema, which was mentioned already, the topography, the VR interface, how it is, the inner retinal and outer retinal problems. So involving all these, we have to basically talk about an OCT. So based on retinal thickening means it could be central involved, non-central involved. Thickness could be no edema, subclinical edema, or established macular edema. The morphology I already mentioned, spongiform, cystoid, serous macular detachment, etc. The topography is non-significant macular edema versus clinically significant. Presence of traction based on the vitreomacular interface, and inner retinal problems like cystoid space, hyperreflective spots, drill and hard exudates, and then outer retinal integrity, ISOS, ELM, intact or distorted. Now let us look at some of the cases. There is no PVD here. Cystoid spaces of multiple sizes are there. There is a little bit of drill and retinal thickening, and there is an intact ISOS junction. So here again, there's another patient in which no PVD, retinal thickening is there, cystoid space. There is a little bit of SMD also, and partly there is spongy edema. There is an intact ISOS junction. So why do we want to classify like all this? Basically, these are all prognostic markers. Finally, the patient does not want to ask us whether I have drill or ISOS junction. The patient will ask only one question, whether I will get good vision, doctor. So some of the good prognostic factors are intact ISOS junction, absence of drill, presence of SMD, low central macular thickness, fewer high resolution spots, and fewer or smaller cystoid spaces. Now let us come to some representative cases. This is another case in which intact ISOS junction is there, no drill, small cyst, no high resolution spots, visual acuity before treatment was 6/18, and you can see that after treatment it improved to 6/6 with a 3-line improvement. Another case with pre-treatment vision of 6/24 with the cystoid space, intact ISOS, no drill, and no high resolution spots, improved significantly. Even though there was a hard exudate right in the center, there was a 3-line improvement in vision. Pre-treatment 6/18 with an SMD, drill is present, few high resolution spots, but you can see that visual acuity improved a 3-line improvement after 6 months. Again, another case in which there was a SMD with high resolution spots, ISOS intact. Now you can see that after 6 months, there was a 4-line improvement. What are some of the poor prognostic factors? Presence of drill or disorganization of the inner retinal layers is a poor prognostic factor. Disruption of ISOS junction, very, very important factor. That's a major game changer. High reflective spots suggest inflammation. Large cyst denote chronicity. Epiretinal membrane and vitreomacular adhesions show resistance to anti-VEGFs and posterior hyaloid also. Here you can see 6/12 taut posterior hyaloid, disrupted ISOS junction. You can see there was actually 1-line drop in vision by 6 months. So this is again another case, large cystoid space, hyperreflective spots, that large cyst is right in the center. You can see the visual acuity is not improving at all with injections. Now, this is another patient with numerous high reflective spots and drill. You can see that even with improvement, the morphology improved, but there was no improvement in visual acuity. Even for surgical cases, we should know that if the ISOS is intact, VMA is diffuse, you can see that visual acuity improves significantly. So this is a more vertical component is there, but you can see that VMT outer layers are normal, and after surgery, vision has improved. Whereas here, there is drill and outer segments not defined so well. After surgery, visual improvement is a little less. Now, this is one paper that we recently published, monitoring the cytokines to actually look at responders and non-responders. And what I did was actually look at what happens to, this is the VEGF level with 6 monthly injections. You can see that at 4th month or 5th month, sometimes the VEGF level increases also a little bit, because the patients who require the number of injections at that point of time is less. Now, what was important is, there was, the red line is the non-responder, in which the visual acuity is worse and the CMT is worse. But when you look at VEGF levels among the responders and the non-responders, since we actually gave injections to these non-responders at the 4th month and the 5th month, and did not give injections to the responders, you can see that the VEGF level actually is lesser in the non-responders, which tells us that it is not VEGF which drives the non-responders, it is the cytokines. So we actually looked at cytokines in those patients, and we had some cases, and I basically tried to correlate these cytokines, IL-6, IL-8, IL-12, IP-10, and MCP-1. These were the significant cytokines which I found, and I correlated these with OCT biomarkers, so that with an OCT biomarker, can we actually pick up the non-responders? And these were the OCT biomarkers that I looked with and correlated with the aqueous biomarkers: the type of edema, spongy or cystoid, hard exudates presence or absent, ISOS junction intact or disrupted, number of high reflective foci less than 10 and more than 10, and drill present or absent, and cone outer segment termination continuous or disrupted. So these were some of the significant things. If it is spongy, the IL-6 levels were 5 times higher than the cystoid type of edema. If the ISOS junction is disrupted, you can see that the IL-6 level was double that of ISOS junction, which is continuous. If drill is present, then it's about 10 times higher. The inflammation is 10 times higher than if drill is absent. So type of edema, again, IL-8 level, spongy, higher IL-8 level. ISOS junction, which is IL-8 is a protective cytokine, unlike IL-6, which is an inflammatory cytokine. So you can see that if ISOS is disrupted, actually the IL-8 level is low. Number of high reflective spots, if less than 10, it is high. So you know that IL-8 is a protective thing. And in all these OCT biomarkers which we linked towards prognosis, you can see that IL-8 level is high and IL-6 level is high wherever we say the OCT biomarkers are basically towards worse prognosis. What about MCP1? Spongy is double that of cystoid, and ISOS junction, which is continuous, double. High reflective foci less than 10 is about 3 times, and hard exudates, if it is absent, it's about double. MCP1 is also a protective. So, I try to correlate the pathology, or etiopathogenic factors with the OCT biomarkers, which we can very easily interpret, and we can say that there is a significant correlation. To conclude, let me say that OCT biomarkers tell us the activity. It will help us define the response to treatment. Good prognostic markers and poor prognostic markers help in counseling the patient significantly. That's a very important thing. Patient always want to know how much treatment will benefit him. And it will also decide on the type of injections. Thank you very much. Over to you, Neha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gopal. That was an excellent presentation on the OCT biomarkers and as well as the study that you have done. Lots for discussion. Let's first go to the next talk and we'll discuss all these points in our panel discussion. So, Dr. Vinod is here?
Yeah.
Okay. So next I invite Dr. Vinod Kumar Agarwal to give his talk. Dr. Vinod is a Associate Professor at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, in the Department of Vitreoretina. He's an excellent surgeon and teacher and has a lot of publications to his credit. So he will be talking about the newer terms relating to age-related macular degeneration. Over to you, Dr. Vinod.
Yeah. Are my slides visible and I am audible?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll be talking about AMD terminologies. Now, OCT, as Dr. Neha mentioned, has revolutionized the retina practice for last 2 decades. It has discovered several new diseases and things which we never saw earlier and now easily visible. And it's now the single most important imaging modality which is available to us. Over the time, it has become high resolution. Earlier it was spectral domain, and now we are using swept source OCT. It provides us optical biopsy at micron levels. Now, why we are discussing all these nomenclatures? The aim of the nomenclature and uniform nomenclature and terminologies is to make the existing terminologies uniform, so that the same thing is not pronounced with 2 different names and we can understand the diseases better. In the short term, they may appear a little bit confusing, but they are useful in the long term and help in spreading medical education. Now, as Dr. Neha mentioned, one of the consensus meeting we heard was about the nomenclature of the terms on the normal OCT. But over a period of time, once the nomenclature has been fixed for the normal OCTs and normal population, there have been consensus meeting happening which decide the uniform terminologies for different set of conditions. We have 2 such in AMD as well. The one which is used for the dry AMD is known as classification of the atrophy meetings, which I'll be referring to as now CAMS. And there is consensus on the non-neovascular AMD nomenclature as well, which I'll be referring to as Conan also. Now, CAMS we predominantly covers the dry or the non-neovascular AMD, what we refer to as geographic atrophy previously. Now, previously, predominantly geographic atrophy was decided on the basis of color photographs. It was defined as an area of 175 microns or more, which was well defined and through which we could have visible choroidal vessels. But even if we use FAF, which is now the gold standard for measuring atrophy, there are limitations. And with OCT, we know that the outer retinal atrophy, at least in certain scenarios, may precede the retinal pigment epithelium atrophy. And that's why we have the need of uh, CAMS, or the classification of atrophy meetings for dry AMD. So let's talk about the CAMS nomenclature first. As opposed to the earlier definition of AREDS, the CAMS believe that 250 microns is a decent number for considering that area of atrophy, and one must not have any RP tier to apply one of these terms. Now, the terms they have described is retinal atrophy or the retinal and retinal pigment epithelial atrophy. So when there is only retinal atrophy, it is known as outer retinal atrophy, which can be incomplete or complete. And when you have retinal and retinal pigment epithelium atrophy, it is known as incomplete retinal and retinal pigment epithelium atrophy, which can be incomplete or complete. Now, there is not as yet the definitions of all of them which are available, but what has been finalized is the definition of complete retinal and retinal pigment epithelium atrophy, which is known as complete RORA. Now, this is one such example. If you see, this is the OCT, and on OCT, if you see, retinal pigment epithelium is gone. So are the outer retinal layers in terms of EZ as well as IZ. And if you see, outer retinal layers are sagging into this area. This is what is known as the subsidence sign. And if you see, there is uniform posterior transmission. And on AF, if you see, these areas are seen as totally black. Another such patient where you see complete RORA. Now, authors have given their images in their prototype images in their articles. This is, as I've shown, complete RORA, where you have atrophy of the retina as well as retinal pigment epithelium. There's total atrophy of the outer retinal layers, and there is homogeneous transmission into the choroid. But in cases of incomplete RORA, what happens is that RP is not gone totally. So some bit of RP is still preserved. As you can see here, the RP is preserved, but in some places, but other places, the RP is gone. And what it results is inhomogeneous transmission of the choroid. Then we come to outer retinal atrophy, which can be complete and incomplete. In both these conditions, the RP is totally intact, while in incomplete outer retinal atrophy, some of the EZ and IZ is visible. In complete outer retinal atrophy, none of the EZ or IZ and ELM is visible. So that is what is the current standard now, and what is being followed for the nomenclature of the atrophy in AMD. Now, what is the importance of these terms? There are studies which are ongoing, which are evaluating various agents which prevent geographic atrophy. Now, when we were using the previous standards, that is color images and the autofluorescence, with those modalities, we were recruiting the patients where already complete geographic atrophy or the complete RORA has happened. Now, these are the patients which are very unlikely to improve with the current standards. So we must recruit those patients who have incomplete atrophy. And that is why we have introduced these terminologies, so that the patients with early atrophy can be recruited and we can assess the effect of these agents which prevent geographic or the retinal and outer retinal atrophy. Now, the second reason why this is important, that with OCT, we know that at least in a certain subset of patients, the outer retinal atrophy precedes the RP atrophy, and especially in patients with subretinal drusenoid deposits. Now, what are these subretinal drusenoid deposits? Now, typically, drusen are seen in the sub-RP space, but these subretinal drusenoid deposits, which were earlier known as pseudodrusen, are seen in the space which is beneath the retina and above the retinal pigment epithelium. These can be of nodular type or of the ribbons type. So if you see, these are the ribbon type subretinal drusenoid deposits, while these are nodular deposits. And these are very well seen on autofluorescence as well as near infrared reflectance images, where they are seen as target lesions, which are bright in the center and dark in the periphery. Now, these are typically can be associated with other drusen type and typically soft drusen. If you see, these are the nodular subretinal drusenoid deposits which are associated with soft drusens and drusenoid PEDs. So on OCT, if you see, these are the subretinal drusenoid deposits which are there above the RP. Now, what is the significance of these SDDs? One, they are independent predictor of retinal RP and geographic atrophy of the retina. They can have a very high incidence with association with RAP or something known as type 3 neovascularization now, and they tend to be associated with thin choroid and high risk of advanced AMD. Now, from India, there is very limited literature available on it, and we have recently published clinical and multimodal imaging modalities, features of subretinal drusenoid deposits. Coming to the next set of terminology, something known as outer retinal tubulation. Now, these are nothing but hyporeflective uh, lumen and hyperreflective margins. So these lesions are typically seen in outer nuclear layer, and several subtypes have also been described. These can be seen in either neovascular AMD, or they can be seen even in non-neovascular AMD. And of late, we have seen that they are present in several kind of dystrophies as well. What is the clinical significance? They indicate that the disease is already advanced, and basically they indicate a kind of healing response by the photoreceptors and indicate a poor prognosis. Now, these are some of the images. If you see, this is a complete outer retinal tubulation which is present in a case of subretinal fibrosis. This is a patient with incomplete outer retinal tubulation which is associated with advanced type 2 neovascularization, which is associated with some bit of intraretinal fluid, and they can be present where they have some bit of hyperreflective deposits inside them. But one thing must be careful is about this particular entity. If you see, this is what looks like a outer retinal tubulation, but is present in the inner retina. And if you see corresponding FA, it is nothing but a microaneurysm. So you must remember that outer retinal tubulations are seen in the outer nuclear layer and not in the inner retina. Coming to neovascular AMD terminologies, now most of them are we are already using. What we referred to as occult CNVM earlier is now known as type 1 CNVM. The classical CNVM, which was above the RP, is now referred to as type 2 CNVM, and the intraretinal CNVM or the RAP is now known as type 3. When you have a combination of these, which we earlier known as minimum classic, is now termed as mixed CNVM. Some other pathologies, some other terminology which have come up new is known as SHRM or subretinal hyperreflective material. Now, let's have a look at one of these patients. This is a patient with neovascular AMD as visible on FA. You see stippled hyperfluorescence in the early phases, which increases in the late phase, and you see a well-defined membrane on the ICG. When we do an OCT in these patients, but you see that this is a type 1 CNVM, and when you do OCT, there is kind of hyper-reflective material which is there in the subretinal space, which is visible in several of the OCT scans. And if you do autofluorescence in these patients, we see that there's no hyper autofluorescence corresponding to these lesions. Now, that is what is known as subretinal hyperreflective material. It can extend into the retina, or it lies underneath the retina. And as per the current definition, it includes everything except blood. Now, how do we distinguish it from vitelliform material? Because it is hypoautofluorescence as opposed to vitelliform material, which is hyperautofluorescence. It can be a mixture of serum, fibrin, or inflammatory cells. And the clinical significance is that it can resolve with anti-VEGF therapy, but when it resolves, it leads to fibrosis, and hence it indicates a poor prognosis in a patient who possesses it in the beginning. The next sign, something known as onion sign, it is clinically seen as something similar to hard exudates, but it tends to be deeper, a yellow material in the sub-RP space. And when you do a OCT through it, what you get is onion peel-like linear hyperreflective bands. Now, some people believe that it is nothing but sub-RP lipid, and over a period of time with treatment, it tends to resolve, though very slowly. Now, a corresponding terminology which has come up recently is something known as multi-layered PD. Now, you must not confuse multi-layered PED with the earlier described onion sign. Now, the onion sign would be visible clinically as yellow hyperreflective material, but multi-layered PEDs would not be seen clinically. They would be seen only on OCT, and they constitute nothing but hyperreflective linear bands which are present beneath the PEDs. And typically they are seen in vascular PEDs, and now we term them as multi-layered PEDs. At times, with the anti-VEGF therapy, what happens is they tend to contract and they separate, and in between them what is left is something known as choroidal cleft, which is a hyperreflective space. Now, why they are important? These are represent a very dramatic appearance, and surprisingly, these eyes tend to maintain a very good visual acuity. Basically because the cicatricial process is confined to the sub-RP space. These prechoroidal clefts have been shown in approximately 10% of the eyes with typical neovascular AMD, but they are more common in type 3 neovascularization. They are associated with poor visual outcome, especially if they develop within 6 months of the treatment. Now, this is again a newer terminology which has come up recently. Now, you see this is a typical drusenoid PED which is visible on OCT as well. They tend to be hyperautofluorescence, and if you see carefully in this particular picture, there's some hyperreflective material overlying this PED which is going into the retina. Now, this patient, if you carefully see over a period of time, this PED tends to flatten a bit, and these hyperreflective materials gradually inch towards the inner retina. Now, this is something what has been referred to as brucellose, and this is one of the proposed hypotheses that these brucellose materials slowly ooze into the inner retina, and these lead to regression of the drusenoid PED, which over a period of time can lead to atrophy of the outer retina. So to sum up, terminologies keep changing over a period of time. With evolving technology, they help us provide a better understanding of the disease progress, and one must be aware about them as they help in the uniform nomenclature and better describe the disease process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vinod. It has always been a pleasure seeing you and hearing your talk. It's indeed a pleasure. Next on, I would want to introduce the chairman of our course, Dr. Neha Goyal, who is an alumnus of the MAMC, Delhi. She's a passionate researcher as far as OCT and imaging is concerned. And she has close to about 90 publications and about 400 citations. Over to you, Neha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gopal. Thank you, Dr. Vinod, for that excellent talk. We'll be discussing it after the last talk, which I will now start. So we started from the vitreous, and now here we are, landed up at the choroid through the retina, RP, and now to the choroid. So are my slides visible? Shall I start?
Yes, yes.
So basically, I'll be discussing these three terms and hoping to make them not as unfamiliar as they might appear in the first go. So this is a representative case of a middle-aged female who had decreased vision in her right eye to 624. Clinically, it looks like choroidal neovascular membrane, and OCT confirms that it's a type 2 CNVM with intraretinal fluid and some exudation as well, some subretinal fluid also. And here is the membrane, which with the flow that you can see on Octa. Now, this is the angiography. And here you see a predominantly classic type of membrane. So this patient was advised anti-VEGF injections, and you can see after the first injection how the membrane is regressing and the fluid is decreasing. Now this is after the 3 injections when the BCVA improved to 6/12. And here you can see there is no fluid, but there is a hyporeflective space here along with a dip in this layer. So this is the membrane again contracting on OCT. So this is what is known as focal choroidal excavation, an unusual concavity in the choroid detected by the OCT, which occurs without a posterior staphyloma or scleral ectasia. And when it occurs in isolation, it is characterized by good visual acuity and a normal overlying retina. So it's common in the 4th to 5th decade, no sex predilection, and is unilateral and non-progressive. These are the cases which have only FCE. But however, more often it is picked up in the presence of a concomitant or unrelated disease, which may be central serous chorioretinopathy, polypoidal choroidal vasculopathy, any type of CNVM. And these are the cause of the visual symptom that lead to the detection of a FCE on OCT. Now, this term was first described by Lee Jampol in Retina in a Diagnostic and Therapeutic Challenge in 2006. And then it was after about 4 years that further classification of this was given into the was given at ACTA. And Margolis published a landmark paper in 2011 in Archives where he termed this as a FCE or a focal choroidal excavation. So since then, the number of articles on this has increased to around about 20 in 2014 to about 130 now in 2021. So FCE are classified into 2. One is confirming FCE when there is no separation and there is preservation of the EZ and RP. And these are the non-conforming where there is a separation of the photoreceptor tips from the underlying RP. And here you get a hyporeflective space, which sometimes might have hyperreflective material, and it may represent SRF with shed outer segment debris or inflammatory material. Now, deeper lesions tend to be wider, and it has been shown that abnormal hyperreflective choroidal tissue can be present in about 50% cases, which may represent scarring. Now, 3 morphological patterns have been described: the cone-shaped, the bowl-shaped, or the mixed type, in addition to conforming and non-conforming. So here are some clinical examples of FCE. This was a middle-aged male with epitheliopathy owing to CSC in both eyes. And here you can see a FCE, which is non-conforming in the right eye and a bowl type in the left eye. Now, they are commonly associated with Best vitelliform macular dystrophy. In fact, that's the commonest dystrophy which shows FCE. And here you can see it is bilateral. And there has been a hypothesis in a paper by Dr. Vinod himself that it's actually related to the occurrence of the fibrotic pillar. Now, this was another patient. He had autosomal recessive bestrophinopathy, where you can see some skytic cavities and here a FCE in the right eye. So this was another interesting case of Stratsma syndrome with MNF, myopia, amblyopia, presented with the macular hole RD, and after surgery was found to have a FCE beneath the closed macular hole. So the current classification which has been proposed is etiology based into congenital or primary, which are the unilateral stationary lesions, or the acquired secondary, which are associated with some other ocular disease, like we have seen pachychoroid disorders, choroidal neovascularization, inflammation, dystrophies, and sometimes choroidal osteomas in the process of deossification. Now, the pathogenesis, several hypotheses have been put forward. In inflammation, it is said that if additions form between the photoreceptors and choroid, it gives rise to a conforming FCE. Whereas if there's mild inflammation or early resolution, it will produce a non-conforming FCE, basically because there is loss of structural integrity of the RPE and basement membrane, causing an outward bulge of the RP. So as I said, in BEST, there is, questionable role of the fibrotic pillars or vitelliform deposits. And in pachychoroid, in which it is most commonly associated, we still do not know the reason for thicker choroids to have a FCE. So it's important to differentiate this from other disorders which have focal choroidal thinning, which, like in this case, which is a post-traumatic choroidal rupture, a choroidal vascular disorder, or some infection. And of course, staphylomas has to be ruled out. So the take-home messages about this entity are that it can be picked up as an incidental finding in asymptomatic eyes, but you must carefully examine the eye and the OCT to rule out CSC, CNVM, PCV, inflammation, and dystrophies. Now, presence of an associated FCE does not alter the prognosis or treatment, and we are yet to understand the clinical significance of this entity. Now, coming to the next case, this was an elderly female with decreased vision in her left eye. She was a myope to 6/18. Here you can see some RP atrophy and some autofluorescence changes. So FFN ICG showed stippled hyperfluorescence and hypercyanescence. And here is the OCT. So a vertical scan shows subretinal fluid with some elongation of the photoreceptor outer segment tips, and you're tempted to make a diagnosis of a central serous chorioretinopathy. But look what happens on the horizontal scan. Here we have what is known as the dome-shaped macula with subretinal fluid, and this is not a CSC. So Octa confirmed absence of neovascularization. This is the other eye of the patient, which was normal. Now, dome-shaped macula or dome-shaped maculopathy is an inward deviation of the macula with respect to the chorioretinal concavity, by definition more than 50 microns on OCT, seen in patients with high myopia. But it has also later been described in eyes with emetropia and hypermetropia or without a staphylogram. The risk factors are an older age and a longer axial length. Now, again, this was first described somewhere in 2008 by Gosher et al. And then there was renewed interest in 2011 to 14, but really picked up after that and today there are more than 150 publications on this entity. Now, the dome can be horizontal, vertical, or a round dome. So a horizontal will only be picked up on a vertical scan. A vertical will be picked up only on a horizontal scan, and a round will be picked up on both scans. So it is important to do both a horizontal and vertical scan of a sufficient length to pick up a DSM. For example, this one will be missed on a horizontal scan, this will be missed on a vertical scan, and if you have a scan of insufficient length, it will miss a round dome. So again, I want to reinforce, you must do at least one horizontal and one vertical scan of sufficient length to detect DSM, especially in myopes where you suspect this. For example, this female, you see the horizontal scan is normal, but look at the vertical scan. Another female, a myope, the vertical scan is normal, but here you pick up the dome on the horizontal scan. Now, the pathogenesis, again, is controversial. It may be scleral introversion, which is resisting the development of staphyloma. Sometimes you see underlying scleral thickening in these cases. It can also be localized variation in the thickness of the sclera. Choroidal thickness changes have been found in some, but not consistently, so it cannot be the pathogenesis in all of them. And what is now accepted is that there are macular basement membrane defects, which lead to a focal relaxation of the posterior staphyloma and this bowing. So the height of the bulge increases with time as a result of the deepening of the surrounding staphyloma. This is not accompanied by a hypermetropic shift. What is the clinical significance of DSM? It does not affect visual acuity by itself unless there is a associated SRF, like we saw in the case of flat irregular PDs and SRF. This is the most common finding associated with DSM. It resolves over time in more than half the patients with resultant RP atrophy. Now, risk factors are a vertical dome, a bulge more than 250 microns, and a greater choroidal thickness. The pathogenesis and the fluctuations are similar to CSC, and treatment is indicated only if there's persistent fluid with visual decline. The same modalities are used as CSC, but the results are still inconclusive. Now, the associated myopia can also cause a CNV, a type 2, most commonly in association with the DSM. And finally, you can get lamellar holes or ERM or even full thickness macular holes. What's the upside of this dome? It has been found to levy a protective effect. So there is less foveal schisis and more extrafoveal schisis, where this dome kind of acts like a macular buckle. Here you can see this area has no schisis at the top of the dome. Now look at this patient. This is a young myope, and these are his scans. This is the vertical scan of the left eye and this of the right eye with some subretinal hyperreflective material, most probably a CNVM. Is this a dome-shaped macula? No, this is what is known as tilted disc syndrome and is a common differential of the DSM. Now, unlike DSM, it is associated with moderate or low myopia, myopic astigmatism. The inferior fundus is tessellated as opposed to the posterior. There you'll find the infranasal tilted disc, infranasal crescent or conus, and situs inversus of the retinal vessels. Since it's an inferior cephaloma, you'll only see that eccentric dome on a vertical scan. So here you'll understand if you see both of them. Here it's only on the vertical scan and the shape is different from a DSM. You can also sometimes confuse it with a choroidal mass lesion, such as a choroidal hemangioma, but a clinical corroboration will make this diagnosis easy. So here you see the shape of the dome is similar, but here you have a hyperreflective space in the choroid when it's a hemangioma. So what are the take-home messages about this entity? It's pretty common in high myopes with longer AL, and you'll find it if you look for it. How do you look for it? Careful OCT scanning with a horizontal and vertical scan of sufficient length. Now, most commonly associated with SRF without CNV, which causes visual decline, and these cases can be misdiagnosed as CSC. So you must also differentiate a dome from a tilted disc syndrome when you come across one. Now, the last entity, coming to peripapillary intrachoroidal cavitation. Now, this is basically an asymptomatic localized orange elevation of the RP in retina, usually seen at the inferior border of the myopic conus. Now, the vein is markedly bent at the border edge. OCT shows an intrachoroidal hyporeflective space beneath the normal RPE plane. Here you can see this is the original paper where it was described. And it's important to recognize this because these are stable lesions which don't affect the visual acuity, but they may result in visual field defects, and you should not misdiagnose it as a glaucoma, as retinoschisis, as a peripapillary CNVM, or a hemangioma, or a granuloma. Now, here you see 3 types have now been described based on EDI. You can just have a peripapillary choroidal cavitation, or you can have it associated with a thickening. So to conclude, these 3 new terms, FC, DSM, and PCC, they are diagnoses that can only be made on OCT. About FC, remember that it doesn't alter the prognosis unless associated with another ocular disease. DSM should be looked for and ruled out in high myopes, and be careful whenever you see a CSC with high myopia, look for a dome. Tilted disc syndrome should also be looked for in these cases, which is a common differential. PCC is a stable lesion and should not be misinterpreted or treated as a glaucoma or a choroidal mass. Thank you all for your patient hearing. And with this, we come to the end of the talks. And I would request all the speakers to be present for the panel discussion. We have 12 minutes. And let's start with Dr. Dipinder's talk. So we saw important entities, the LHEP and the EIFL, which we should commonly use in our practice. So any comments from the panelists on these terms? Please go ahead.
I think LHP is something which is really useful in clinical scenario. And the reason being full thickness macular holes, we all know that we have to operate, and they do well. Lamellar holes have always been a dilemma whether we should operate them or should leave them behind. Well, some of them do well, some of them do not well and do not do well. So if LHAP is there, but this is one of the indicators that this patient is likely to have not so good outcome after the surgery, and we can help prognosticate the patient.
I think we should use a combination of factors, including the visual acuity, including the morphology of the lesion, and obviously patient factors also in deciding the surgical decision.
Absolutely.
I can add a line that knowing about LHEP also helped us realize that not everything lying at the edge of the macular hole has to be peeled off. And we, there was a time when we used to peel everything off macular hole to free the edges, and concept was, remove all gliotic tissue. And so now we are realizing that some of this might be beneficial, and that's why we resorted to ILM flaps and other things. So providing a scaffold, people are using amniotic membrane and other things. So the whole concept has changed. I think we started with getting rid of everything, and now we are like going for a mix and match that remove the tractional component, but let the scaffolding component be there.
Absolutely. So these
in this regard, may I just ask the panel here, like Deepu was basically talking about an amniotic membrane being kept there. Vinod, can you tell me a situation where you would want to actually keep an amniotic membrane and not a free ILM flap from any other area of the retina?
I don't see any reason why you should put a amniotic membrane and not a free ILM flap. I don't see any reason. In fact, Dr. Dipen, I was going to that. If I can share a slide, please.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have seen, as Dr. Dipender mentioned, that not everything has to be peeled off. Now, see this case with the intraoperative OCT, we found that in some of the cases when we peel ILM, even after the ILM peeling was complete, we could see that some remnants of the tissues were available at or residual tissue was there at the edges of the hole. And we found that when we analyzed that when these tissues were present, even the larger holes closed. So that is very important that we do not peel off everything in the even in full thickness macro holes. Whatever is left behind acts as a scaffold and helps in closure of the hole. So in fact, we labeled it as hole door sign, and it is now published in Retina. This is just for your reference. This is how an inverted ILM flap would look like. Something similar, and it acts as a scaffold so that the hole can close.
Yeah, great point. I think absolutely.
And coming back to Dr. Gopal's point, I think if ILM is available, pre-ILM flap, though it is little difficult to fashion and little more difficult to place at fovea, I think any given day I would rather go for ILM flap rather than amniotic flap. If it was my eye, I would never like a allogenic graft to be put.
And it has to be planned also if you are planning amniotic membrane.
Yes,
many times you encounter an intraoperative situation, where you have not planned, and so amniotic membrane is, that's why not have become very popular choice. I agree with both of you.
Yeah, I think you can put even full thickness graft. That makes a sense, but people have put all sort of things,
posterior capsule and other things.
So amniotic membrane and everything.
Okay, so coming back to the OCT imaging after that surgical discussion, Dr. Gopal, your talk was excellent, and we have I think all medical retina people have been waiting when we'll get a kit. When you are injecting anti-VEGF, you just do AC paracentesis, and that aqueous sample or even vitreous will tell you what's going on inside the eye, and like you mentioned, the biomarkers, how we correlate them with the OCT. So something I've been thinking of, and maybe you can take it forward, that this would make a very nice AI model, that you put in the demography of the patient, the history, the systemic factors, the biomarkers on OCT and on from your fluid analysis, and the AI will maybe be able to even predict till how long you have to give injections, how many injections will be required, so that maybe you can work on that in the future. What do you think? Mm.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Definitely, I think more than one factor. We should basically take cumulatively all the factors that we can get. But for making such an AI model, you require huge amount of information in which the patient's demographics, the patient's sugar control, the hypertensive control, the renal factors, the morphology of the eye, the OCT biomarkers, the aqueous biomarkers, all this have to be. We should have a lot of patients in that particular level.
Yes, but
But I
I really
think
think
that
it's
will
the future.
individualize the treatment to
Yes.
that particular patient. And that is the way forward, I think. And
Yeah.
probably you can add genetics to it also.
Absolutely. The way Dr. Rohit Shetty has done it for keratoconus, I really feel for diabetic macular edema, that is what the researchers should now focus on, getting an AI model which incorporates all these factors. So any comments on Dr. Gopal's talk, Dr. Dipinder, Dr. Vinod?
I think whole beauty about this OCT terminologies is you notice an observation. You start with a finding, then you find a prognostic and staging and research relevance, that how it can be relevant. Then you start linking it with at molecular level with, like Gopal has done, with cytokines or other markers uh, by all those your histopathological studies. And then you find a treatment which can be tailored to that specific disease whenever you see those findings. Actually, that's actually the completion of the whole loop. And interestingly, there is a very recent article which I found that cytokines which are secreted by macrophages, M2 and MCSF, they were found to be elevated in patients having ectopic inner foveal layer. So exactly same thing which Dr. Gopal has done for DME. So now people are going to bring more and more data which will link these findings to molecular level research. So this would be very interesting, and AI is a very good proposition, I think, because if you get so much of information, to convert it into a meaningful, practically useful staging or grading it, you will need AI like things.
Yes.
And on the top of that, I think one should not forget the about basic clinical examination. That is the paramount in all scenarios. At times we talk about sophisticated OCT terminologies like hyperreflective dots and even the small signs we have all talked about. But we forget about the gross signs which are there, the pupillary reactions and all those carry a lot of value, and we all should not forget that. For example, people have been saying that hyperreflective dots carry inflammatory value and all those things, but then there are other signs in the eye, which can uh, reflect the same and should not be ignored.
Yes,
Yes,
absolutely.
Vinod, absolutely, because it's a cumulative thing.
Yeah.
And another important thing in the same breath I want to say is, whether this particular disease is active or inactive. This disease requires active intervention again and again or not. That is something that is a clinical judgment. That obviously OCT can complement on it, but definitely there should be a clinical judgment. How much is the amount of scar which is there, and how much is the amount of, see, even a CNVM with a huge scar, there may be a little bit of edema, significant edema also, but not so much visual potential is. So that is a clinical thing that you should always.
Yeah. At the same time, it has brought forth the diseases we never knew about. For example, uh, myopic retinoschisis, we never knew about it until the OCT came. And even the dome-shaped macula, I think hundreds of them would have been diagnosed as CSR. Even now, I see on and off referrals which come as CSC in high myopia, and things like FC. So we all have seen, but now it's that the terminology is there, so we all can recognize. So that is one of the advantages of newer nomenclature.
So clinically, I would like to, ask you all, like Dr. Dipinder said, the staging of ERM, how often clinically would you like to do an OCT to stage it? As you said, they can change. Then again, we said there's a high incidence of DSM in myopes. How often would you like to do an OCT routinely in myopes to look for this entity? How do these terms translate into our clinical practice is what I would like to ask.
I think all visits, if they are follow-up visits for their retinal condition, we do imaging, unless they come for a unscheduled visit for some other eye issue. Like if a ERM patient is not being operated and asked for a follow-up every 3 months, all visits has to be OCT visits, imaging visits.
And regarding the DSM thing, I think it's very important that whenever you get a myope, which has unexplained vision loss clinically, you must do a OCT.
No, that of course, but even because the dome can be asymptomatic also.
Yeah,
so
I don't.
If there is no vision loss, like we said, PCC, it's a finding in high myopes, which is asymptomatic. So, what would be your threshold for advising an OCT to a myope who's asymptomatic? That is what I would like to ask.
I wouldn't.
I also wouldn't.
Yes. So usually we pick these up when the other eye has a pathology or, there is.
Or there is symptomatic, or there is a symptomatic disease.
I think
Hi, Saravanan.
Take home message should be the patient and not the OCT. Hi, sir.
So I think we are well in time. I am very grateful to all my co-instructors for preparing such wonderful talks and taking out time and sharing their knowledge and experience with us. Dr. Dipinder, Dr. Gopal, Dr. Vinod, thank you so much. I thank AIOS for this opportunity and for the excellent organization. Thank you, Mr. Prasad. Over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neha. Thank you so much to all the speakers, and a big congratulations to all of you for keeping it under time. We really had a great time. All right, we can see a few hands moving and waving at each other, and that's the good thing about the virtual conference, I guess. We can see each other, we can see each other's face, and at least virtually we can make someone smile. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.